If your friend tells you that she had an argument with her landlord, what comes to mind? So when I hear something like that, what I imagine is a heated, uncomfortable, and probably aggressive exchange that exists within the context of interpersonal conflict. Now, in philosophy, we mean something very different than that when we use the word argument. In philosophy, an argument is a set of sentences. That's what an argument is. And some of these sentences are premises, and at least one of these sentences is a conclusion. And in an argument, the premises support the conclusion. Now, the line between bad arguments and non-arguments is really hard to draw because things get kind of fuzzy when we really push the boundaries. And I'll give you an example. Consider the following set of sentences. So, it is Tuesday. Florid flowers and summer dresses catalyze impressions. Therefore, dreams soar on the rhymer's only floor. So is that a bad argument or not an argument at all? I'm actually not sure. So the presence of a conclusion that begins with therefore gives off the impression that what has been said before is supposed to support the conclusion. But I don't really know what those sentences mean other than that's Tuesday and there's no obvious connection between them. So things get a little bit clearer when we ask what makes an argument a good argument. And we'll begin with an example. So premise 1, I live in Alabama. Premise 2, everyone who lives in Alabama is green. Conclusion, therefore I am green. Now there's obviously a few things wrong with that argument, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, but I first just want to focus on what is good about it. So what's good about that argument is that the premises and the conclusion are connected in the right way. Specifically, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. To put it another way, it is impossible for the premises all to be true and the conclusion to be false. As long as the premises are all true, the conclusion is true also. And this might seem confusing, so let's just work through it slowly. So the first premise was that I live in Alabama. So let's just imagine that I really do live in Alabama. Second premise was that everyone who lives in Alabama is green. So let's again use our imagination and conceive of a world where everyone in Alabama is green. It's just a law of nature. If you are in Alabama, it is just the case that you will be green. When we imagine that both of those statements are true, that I really live in Alabama, and that everyone who does so is green, then we must also imagine that I am green. In fact, it is logically impossible for the first two statements to be true, these premises to be true, and for the third one, the conclusion to be false. And if you try to imagine a world where the first two premises are true and the conclusion is false, you're going to fail. And if you think that you succeeded, then you either made a mistake or I didn't do a good enough job of describing the premises in the argument. But I think it's probably the first one because, I think I was pretty clear in describing them. But let me know if that's not the case. But at any rate, what I've just been talking about is something called validity. So an argument is valid just in case the premises entail the conclusion. So to put it another way, an argument is valid just in case the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. To put it a third way, an argument is valid if the truth of the premises is inconsistent with the falsity of the conclusion. So let's go back to the argument. Premise 1, I live in Alabama. Premise 2, everyone who lives in Alabama is green. Conclusion, therefore I am green. Now, as I said, there is one good thing about that argument. It's valid. But imagine if the conclusion were different. Instead of therefore I'm green, let's change the conclusion to therefore Dalmatians are green. That argument is not valid because the premises don't guarantee the conclusion. It is logically possible that I am a Dalmatian or that, all Dalmatians live in Alabama. Neither of these two things is guaranteed by the first two premises because it's also logically possible that the first two premises are true and I'm a green human or that some Dalmatians live outside of Alabama. So let's go back to the original version of the argument. As I said, the argument has one good thing going for it. It's valid. But it is still a bad argument because the premises are false. Premise 1 is false because I do not actually live in Alabama. I live in Wisconsin. Premise 2 is false because it's not true that everything that lives in Alabama is green. I've met lots of wonderful people in Alabama who were not green. So notice that we're shifting now. We're shifting from talking about the logical structure of the argument to the truth of its premises. Our argument passed the logical structure test. It is valid, but it failed once we started to examine the truth of its premises. And we will say that an argument is sound, just in case it is valid and the premises and conclusion are true. So even though our argument is valid, it is not sound because its premises and conclusion are false. So before we go on, I want to slow down and get real precise about language. We use different words to evaluate arguments and premises. When we're saying that an argument is good or bad, we need to be precise and indicate that the argument is either valid or invalid, or sound or unsound. In a philosophy class, you should never say that an argument is true or false, because the words true and false apply to premises and conclusions rather than to arguments. When we're talking about premises, though, we should never say that a premise is valid, or a statement is valid, or invalid, or sound or unsound. Instead, what we need to say is that the premise or conclusion is true or it is false. And finally, note that the validity, soundness, truth, and falsity, and all those things are objective claims about the way that the world is, rather than subjective claims about what people believe. So consider the following argument. Premise 1, it is nighttime in Florence. Premise 2, when it is nighttime in Florence, the earth has rotated so that the sun is not visible to people in Florence. Conclusion, therefore, the earth has rotated so that the sun is not visible to people in Florence. This argument is sound, but nobody would have taken it seriously back when the Ptolemaic model of the solar system predominated, because back then everyone thought that the sun revolved around the earth rather than the earth revolving around the sun, or rotating. So that argument was not rationally persuasive during the time of Ptolemaic astronomy. And an argument is rationally persuasive if it is sound and the audience accepts its premises. The audience believes that it is sound. Rational persuasiveness is an important feature of arguments because arguments are often tools that we use to convince people to accept conclusions. And so for this reason, it's a really good idea to argue from statements that your audience is going to accept rather than from idiosyncratic statements that you believe but that your audience is not going to accept. So that's why in my video on the golden rule, if you recall that one, I said that the golden rule was a good tool to use in your arguments. This is because arguments based on the golden rule are more likely to be rationally persuasive than arguments based on idiosyncratic principles that your audience doesn't accept because of how ubiquitous the golden rule is. You find it everywhere. So when you're making arguments or you're evaluating arguments, you need to check for three things. Number 1, is it valid? Number 2, is it sound? And number 3, is it rationally persuasive? If it meets all three criteria, then you're good to go. You have a good argument in your hands. If it's invalid or unsound, then you gotta throw it out or revise it. If it's sound but not rationally persuasive, it could still be valuable for some purposes, but it's probably not going to be useful in any social situations where you want to persuade somebody of something. Now, there's a whole science to figuring out whether extremely complicated arguments are valid. And they're really interesting techniques. You want to learn them, you got to go take a course in formal logic. I can't cover them here. I'm not even going to start, but I will give you a few shortcuts for determining whether an argument you would like to use is valid. So the first two shortcuts are forms that valid arguments can take. Now, not all valid arguments take these forms, but any argument that does take these forms is valid. So the first one is called Modus Tollens, and it looks like this. Premise 1, if P, then Q. Premise 2, P. Conclusion, therefore Q. And you can construct arguments in English by substituting the letters with the statements. So if I'm a snail, then I have a shell. I am a snail, therefore I have a shell. The second form we'll talk about is called Modus Tollens, and it looks like this. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And we can again substitute statements for the letters. If I went to the store, then I have bread. I don't have bread, therefore I didn't go to the store. So any argument that follows those forms is valid. And to test this, Imagine a world where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. It can't be done. You can try it for yourself, but it can't be done. And now, to reiterate, these are not the only two valid argument forms, and there are many others that you can look up. If you want to know more, there's probably infinitely many, but three that I would say to check out if you're interested are hypothetical syllogism, disjunctive syllogism, and constructive dilemma. So there's also lots of argument forms such that any arguments that have those forms are invalid. So this is to say, if you see these arguments, if you see an argument with this form out in the wild, you will know that that argument is invalid. I'm going to give you two, but again, there's infinitely many ways to make an invalid argument. So the first one is called affirming the consequent. It goes like this. Premise 1, if P, then Q. Premise 2, Q, conclusion, therefore P. Now, if-then statements have two parts, an antecedent and a consequent. The antecedent comes at the beginning. The consequent comes at the ending after the then. In this case, we are affirming the consequent because we are assuming that the consequent Q is true and then drawing a conclusion from that assumption. So all of that was quite abstract. So let's get concrete by substituting statements for letters. If I went to the store, then I bought bread. I bought bread, therefore I went to the store. Now, I want you to really feel the invalidity of this argument, so we're going to work through it slowly. Imagine a world where it is just a law of nature that I buy bread every time I go to the store. There's just no way that I could go to the store and not buy bread. It just can't happen. So now imagine that you see me carrying a loaf of bread and I tell you that I bought it. The question you need to ask is it logically possible that I did not go to the store? And the answer to this question is yes, because there are all sorts of ways that one can buy bread. For example, I buy one from a random person on the street or a food cart. The fact that I always buy bread when I go to the store doesn't mean that the only place I buy bread is the store. And since it is logically possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, the argument is invalid. Any argument that has that argument pattern is invalid. But keep in mind that invalid arguments can still have true conclusions. It might be the case that I, in fact, did buy bread from the store. The point I'm making is just that the premises in that argument don't guarantee that conclusion. So I'm going to conclude with one more shortcut, one more invalid argument form. And this is called denying the antecedent. It goes like this. If P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. Now this time we have denied the first part of the if-then statement, the antecedent, and then tried to draw a conclusion from that. That's why we call it denying the antecedent. So let's again substitute statements. Premise 1, if you work for a hedge fund, then you have a job. Premise 2, you don't work for a hedge fund. Conclusion, therefore you don't have a job. So we're going to work through this final example slowly to show you why it's invalid. Now, we're imagining a world where if you work for a hedge fund, you'll have a job. This is not difficult because work for a hedge fund is a job. Now let's imagine that you don't work for a hedge fund. This is also not hard to do. I don't work for a hedge fund. You probably don't either. And perhaps you're a barista, a professional MMA fighter, or even a subcontractor for a construction, in the construction industry. Now, clearly the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises because there's lots of ways that I just surveyed, and there's many more that you can have a job that doesn't involve any hedge funds whatsoever. The fact that everyone who works for a hedge fund has a job doesn't mean that only people who work for hedge funds have jobs.